Congressman Jamaal Bowman was elected in November of 2020 and was seated as part of the 117th Congress this past January. He represents New York's 16th district, which includes the Northern Bronx and parts of Westchester County, including Yonkers, New Rochelle, and Mount Vernon. New York City born and raised, Congressman Bowman spent his early years in public housing and rent-controlled apartments. A lifelong educator with more than 20 years experience as a teacher, he founded and was principal of a community school in the Bronx prior to running for this office. Congressman Bowman is the vice chair of the Education and Labor Committee and the chair of the Energy Subcommittee on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. He's a fierce advocate for racial and economic justice, and most relevant for our conversation today, for broadband and affordable housing. In March, Congressman introduced Broadband Justice Act, which aims to provide subsidized broadband to approximately 8 million federally assisted households by updating HUD, Treasury, and USDA utility allowance definitions to include broadband, providing increased operating funds for monthly broadband subsidies, and creating a grant program for housing providers to support broadband infrastructure improvements. Well, thank you, Congressman, for joining us for NYSAFAH's 22nd Annual Affordable Housing Conference. You know, we've been very involved in broadband for a couple of years now, and we're delighted to have you join us as a real advocate in our space. So maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about, as a lifelong educator, what about your experience made you realize the importance of broadband in the lives of your students and the constituents in general?
Yeah, sure. First of all, hello. Thank you for having me. Yeah, so I worked in education for 20 years. All throughout that time, I spent all my time in Title I schools. I was a teacher, school counselor, and middle school principal for 10 years. And without access to broadband, you don't have access to the world beyond your community, right? You don't have access to resources. You don't have access to learning opportunities. You don't have access to social opportunities. And in our school, we fought to get access to broadband in our school initially, and then access to the hardware so that students can benefit from the broadband. So before I resigned, we were ready for remote learning because we did the work prior to the pandemic to be ready for it. But many kids, millions of kids across the country were not. So it's both access to remote learning opportunities and curricula, but it's also access to, the encyclopedia of the internet and the world beyond, your community. And it's key. And as we know, low-income communities have less access to broadband, and because you're poor, shouldn't remove this opportunity for you. So yeah, I saw it with my students. We fought, in our school to give them access. Mm-hmm. And coming into Congress in the middle of a pandemic where kids were trying to access online learning, it was obviously needed. So, that's why we introduced the Broadband Justice Act.
That's fantastic. At NYSAFAH, we heard similar concerns from families in our units across the state. And NYSAFAH had a pilot last year, and I guess part of this year, it's called community classrooms. And we brought students down into community spaces that had Wi-Fi, and we paid monitors to be there and help them get online. So they had a virtual classroom right there in their housing building so that they could go to school virtually. It was a pilot, and I hope we can continue to do something similar with after school opportunities, because these buildings do, to some extent, provide a hub for internet access. So talk to us about the transition from then housing to really looking at affordable housing as the access point.
Well, yeah. So, when you live in federally subsidized affordable housing, your utility costs are a part of the overall package that comes with your voucher and your subsidy. So it's important for us to redefine broadband as a utility, so it can be included in the overall federal subsidy. And that's just a game changer for families, as opposed to the $7 of support that families are currently receiving. This will provide resources up to $50 of support for each family, which again is a game changer and huge. You know, what you just mentioned though about the work you do as in terms of using a building or community as a hub, that's really key because learning is a collaborative process, and the more kids can learn alongside their peers and other kids, the better. So, you know, home access is essential and that opportunity is critical, but in terms of learning amongst your peers within your community, building infrastructure would be key too. And, you know, the American Jobs Plan, you know, has a focus on affordable housing, which is exciting and great. It also has a focus on broadband, you know, and as we move forward and as we become a fully accessible, equitable, renewable energy economy, any investment in affordable housing has to bring the broadband element with it. And any new construction, any retrofits must also include broadband as well.
I think that's extremely important and very forward thinking of you. How can we help make sure that your bill remains a central component of the final infrastructure bill? And what can NYSAFAH members be doing across the state to help? I know in New York City, you probably already know, has now required in their new design guidelines, and we'll be talking about this in the panel in a few minutes. Now, all New York City new affordable housing will be required to not only provide the infrastructure for broadband access in housing, but also make it a free service that comes just like any other utility. It's very forward step, big forward step, and we hope the state will follow along, but it really needs to be a national mandate, I think.
Yeah, and it looks like we're heading in that direction. So to help us out, please continue to engage with our legislative team to keep us informed of the work you're doing and what's happening on the ground, and continue to lobby our U.S. Senators Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand, as well as the White House, as well as leadership in the House. So Speaker Pelosi, Majority Leader Hoyer, Majority Whip Clyburn, and Chairman Jeffries. You know, lobbying them and pushing them and showing them that we have millions of people supporting this initiative is going to be key. But we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you and engage with you so that we can advocate accordingly as well, not just with legislation, but with letter writing and lobbying also.
Absolutely. We're fully behind this and anything we can be doing, you know, and we'd welcome you to come to any of our NYSAFAH events when you're in New York and get to know us in person. We're hoping in the future we'll be able to have these events as we have previously in person, and it's a great chance to learn a lot more about affordable housing and for us to hear more about all the important work you're doing on our behalf in Washington. Anything else you want our members to know, or did I miss anything about your proposal?
Well, no, just keep organizing, keep fighting, keep pushing elected officials at every level. We cannot relent. You know, this is a special moment in Washington where we have Democratic control of the White House, Senate, and House. So like let's be very bold and visionary and urgent in this moment and continue to organize and continue to build. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us this morning. And please, if you have time, participate in any part of the conference. We'd love to have you join some more of our talks. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Peace and love, everyone.
Thank you, Jolie, and thank you to Congressman Bowman for sharing those words and kicking us off today. My name is Anjali Fernandez, and I am a Senior Associate Product Manager at Schmidt Futures. As part of my work at Schmidt Futures, I've helped lead the staff for the Reimagine New York Commission created by the governor, which focused on ways the state could use technology to build back better. A core finding of the commission was that ensuring universal internet connectivity was a prerequisite for a resilient and equitable New York. And to that end, the commission recommended interventions by the state and private actors, including increasing the scale and adoption of affordable access programs, supporting students, and piloting the use of novel technologies and tools to increase connectivity. At Schmidt Futures, we're helping to provide the philanthropic support needed to realize some of these commission ambitions, including by mobilizing support for NYSAFAH's efforts to ensure connectivity in affordable housing. So I'm very excited to moderate this panel today on how affordable housing can help move us towards high quality internet access and universal adoption, starting in New York and as a model really for the nation. Each of our panelists, who I hope will be able to turn on their video soon, will bring us a different perspective in this conversation, and they each play a unique role in this space. So I will turn it over to them to introduce themselves briefly, and then we can kick off our conversation. Danny, I'll turn it to you first.
Thanks so much, Anjali. I'm Danny Fuchs. I'm the managing partner of the New York office of HR&A Advisors. I'm the former director of capital planning for the Department of City Planning in New York. My work in broadband goes back to seeking to manage the Neighborhood Development Fund to invest in broadband in neighborhoods that the city was rezoning several years ago, and more recently has been related to the New York City Internet Master Plan and other work that I'll be glad to be talking about here today. Also, I'm the co-founder of the Broadband Equity Partnership, which is a consultancy with a mission to empower communities to shape their broadband future from the bottom up and the locality up.
Thanks, Danny. Rona?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I am Rona Rito-Dika, the Assistant Commissioner of Building and Land Development Services at HPD, also known as BUILDS. We are part of the Office of Development, and we provide various technical services for HPD-assisted projects. We are the ones that conduct the design reviews, the environmental reviews, construction monitoring for all projects that go through HPD. My team also recently launched the HPD design guidelines for new construction, which I'm really excited to talk about.
Yes. Next, Rodney, why don't you go?
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you all today. My name is Rodney Capel. I'm Vice President for State Government Affairs for Charter Communications, better known locally to everyone in Spectrum. I am the lead on our regulatory, legislative, and community engagement pieces that we work in our footprint in 4 of the boroughs of New York City, as well as New Jersey, and a small footprint in Mount Vernon, New York. I've spent about 20 years of my career in government and politics, serving as a high-level staffer for Senator Chuck Schumer and Governor Cuomo, and also former ED of the Democratic Party. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks, Rodney. And last but not least, Steve.
How are you? Thank you for having me. I'm Steve Murthel. I'm the Vice President of Information Technology for WestHab, Chester-based developer that builds supportive housing in New York City and Westchester. We serve over 2,500 households, and we have new and existing projects currently. I focus primarily on building infrastructure for existing and new projects moving forward in New York City and Westchester. And this focus has been mainly on broadband infrastructure and services for these units.
Thanks, Steve. We're really excited to dig into a lot of what you're doing in those projects. But to start, Rona, I'd like to turn to you. As the Congressman and Julie alluded to earlier, New York City recently released new design guidelines about affordable housing that would not only require broadband access, but also treat it as a utility. I'd love for you to share a little bit more about the process of creating those guidelines and what you think is most important for the affordable housing community to know about these new guidelines.
Sure. Thanks, Anjali. So, I mean, broadband right now, as we all know, is like the hot topic, right? We've seen a lot of proposed legislation on how we can provide universal broadband. And I think New York City, for us, you know, we actually intended to release our design guidelines in June of last year, but then the pandemic hit, so everything was put on pause. But the silver lining of that was we were able to take additional time to really think about how we can respond to the needs that were highlighted by the pandemic, right? There were a lot of inequities, a lot of access issues, one of them including broadband. And so with the additional time, we were able to form a working group and really think about how we can include certain things like broadband into our new construction design guidelines. And we formed a working group around like November, December of last year with members of NYSAFAH, CHPC, and Shinny, and just others from our partners from the housing industry. And we literally met like every week to decide like what do we need to include in our design guidelines to respond to this pandemic, right? It's just the idea of not letting this crisis go to waste. And obviously, you know, the main topic was broadband. How do we bring broadband into our affordable housing projects? And for the most part, everybody in the working group was very supportive of it. We were just trying to figure out how to do it. You know, as everybody knows, there's just different types of technology. It's always evolving. You know, there's wire, there's wireless, there's mesh, there's open network. There were so many different ways to provide broadband. And I think what we came up with was more of a like performance spec and not so much prescriptive. So in March, we launched our updated design guidelines for new construction. And part of that is providing broadband for all of our units or affordable housing. It was really an interesting like participatory process with our stakeholders to come up with a lot of the requirements. And I'll go through some of what we now require. It was launched in March. And some of our requirements are, you know, high quality, secure internet access in all of our units at no cost to the tenant. So that means it should be included as part of their lease. We're also requiring a wired connection in each living room, as well as wireless Wi-Fi throughout the entire unit. And we're saying, you know, a preferred 100 megabits up and down speed with the ability for the tenant to upgrade at their additional cost. So these are some of the things that we're requiring. We're also doing like a broadband where feasible, because we know that this is relatively new and there are members of the industry that still need to become up to speed with how to provide broadband in our housing. So there is some flexibility there, but the idea is to get everybody on board with thinking about ways to provide broadband in their new construction projects.
Thanks, Rona. You mentioned obviously the immense urgency of this work and not letting a good crisis go to waste. A particular part of what you described is ensuring high quality access. And I'd love to turn actually to Rodney, perhaps. I'd love to hear your perspective, you know, coming from private industry and the ISP organizations, you know, what are the most important challenges and opportunities that you see your organization playing in helping ensure high quality access, both as the New York City guidelines come into effect, but also just more broadly as we try to build back better from the pandemic?
No, I appreciate the question. It's a high priority for us to be able to provide our customer base high quality internet service. You know, there's been obviously surge in the need for the broadband services at home, whether it was through school, whether it was through work. And so that need sort of crystallized that effort that we needed to present to our customer base. We tried since the beginning, one, to not only try and create opportunities for, in particular, low income customers, free offers for their students, whether it was opportunities to create bulk purchase opportunities for NYCHA, supporting homeless shelters, which is a project we worked on last year. How do we create opportunity for adoption for our services so that we are creating opportunities for folks to have that type of high quality internet service? And we've tried to do that at great speeds. We offer up to a gig of speed already as a company. And we want to continue to try and sort of create avenues and resources for communities who may not have that access available to them.
Danny, I saw you nodding earlier. You know, there are elements of, as Rona mentioned, design guidelines that are as feasible. And part of the question is, how do we move from what is feasible and what is ideal down to the tools and tactics that are needed to actually help housing developers implement these guidelines. So I'd love to hear your perspective on what that looks like.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I must say that the new design guidelines that Rona and the team have advanced are truly groundbreaking, and I hope establish a national model for the way we deal with new construction, but also eventually preservation deals, so that we can wind up having that level of high quality throughout the unit and for free, which part of the answer to that question, I think, Anjali, is in Congressman Bowman's bill, which needs to be passed as a part of the Americans Jobs Plan to ensure that broadband is an eligible rent expense for developers. But there's also a need to connect the development community to internet service, a broader array of internet service providers, managed service providers, and other professionals that can help navigate what is a much more complex landscape now with many more providers than just Rodney's colleagues and others. But I'll tell you that I think that while the new construction and then eventually preservation deals are going to set a new model for new units moving forward, I'm particularly focused and pleased to be working with NYSAFAH on programs to address those who might otherwise be left behind. That is, tenants in affordable housing that are not up for preservation deals. The largest stock of affordable housing across the state does not have a capital event coming up. And so how is it that they will go beyond the existing predominantly coaxial cables in their buildings and often single service provider cable service in this massive portfolio to wind up having fiber or fiber-like speeds moving forward? There's no version of that does not require, frankly, state intervention and a massive amount of capital infusion, because right now, for a long time, people have addressed the digital divide either from the infrastructure side, that we need to lay new fiber and fiber to every premise, or from the people side, that we need to invest in subsidies for subscribers or digital literacy. But there's really a need for a building-based approach, because that's where these two things meet. And we need to figure out how it is often that we actually rewire buildings and wind up getting new conduit in those buildings to enable both higher quality service and sometimes more competition in that portfolio. I could certainly go on for much longer on that, but I don't want to take up too much time at the moment.
We will come back to a lot of what you just mentioned, but I want to bring in Steve, because you offer us the developer perspective in this conversation. What of what Danny just mentioned resonates with you? And talk to us a little bit about some of the projects that you're working on right now to help ensure broadband access in some of your current developments.
Absolutely. I was smiling the whole time Danny was speaking, because he's everything you said is on point. Scale and capture this moment that we're in right now. So I'll start from the developer perspective. When the pandemic hit, the families that were housed in our buildings, those buildings turned into schools, right? So everyone's home became their classroom. So the part of the urgency around getting broadband to those facilities, did not fall to the wayside. So we reached out to ISP providers, tried to figure out with the city what the plans were to get sometimes coax, sometimes fiber, whatever the solution was to those buildings. We provided hotspots. We provided spots within the buildings and facilities where they would have Wi-Fi access. So this is like putting up access points, having a computer lab here and there, having connected devices. So it's always going to be a mix of solutions. And I find that the technology is not the hardest part. It's the coordination, the communication, the deployment. Those pieces need tight, or else you have a bunch of devices out in the wild and people are like, what do I do with this? How do I use this? How do I get connected? The most intriguing project I'm working on right now is a rapid deployment of broadband in Nodine Hill in Yonkers. And this is the epitome of what it looks like to have a tremendous partnership. This is under US Ignite, but we are working with the City of Yonkers, STEM Alliance, Westchester County Association, and other groups to cover all of the pieces I just described, which is the deployment, the coordination, the rollout, the communication to let people know what Wi-Fi looks like. Initially, I had a $250,000 grant for just hardware from Cisco to build out the Wi-Fi infrastructure for day 63 unit family affordable housing building in Yonkers, and that community hub. So just like Congressman Bowman spoke about buildings being the community hubs, we have that building and a community center next door. And I've built infrastructure to have Wi-Fi inside and outdoor. So if we were gonna do something like a class outside, families could do that. If we're gonna do some kind of workforce development across the street, you could do that. But the challenge was trying to expand the reach of the Wi-Fi we could provide for free. So this is where US Ignite comes in, and their project to push, Project Overcome, to push and expand the deployment of broadband. And we are using a project called CBRS, which is fixed wireless. And fixed wireless is when you put an antenna on your building and someone else puts an antenna on their building, and we give you a device that connects to that frequency. CBRS is pretty unique because it's a protected range that's regulated by the FCC. So now you have dedicated wireless without all the noise and all the interference that may happen with other solutions. So that's going to deploy this summer, and we're super excited about being able to deliver a Wi-Fi service to over 250 families, provide the devices, provide education that goes with the devices so that people can do workforce development, develop their careers, and kids can get online during the summer and for the next school year.
Yeah. Steve, everything you're describing, it's really this end-to-end model of how a building or an affordable housing complex can be the locus of everything that an individual or a family or a household needs in order to truly be connected. Because I think, Rona, you've mentioned this. This has come up in many conversations that, you know, connectivity is not just having a device. It's not just having a connection. It's also having everything end to end that shows you how to actually use what you have and leverage the speeds that you're given as well. I'd like to open this up to the entire group, but Steve, a lot of what you discussed, you know, you're thinking about the trade-offs between particular technologies, and given a particular building, you know, what is the best solution for that site? And what is the most appropriate, both financially and technologically feasible opportunity to connect this particular location? What tools do we think are most important in helping housing developers make these decisions? What data should they be leveraging? What sorts of guidance and strategies can they be leaning on to understand, you know, what is the right decision for my building?
Want to take that?
Yeah, I was going to say,
I'll take it a little bit.
Okay, can I just preface that with, I think that's a really great point. And Steve, you know, mentioned a key word in this, which I think is partnership, right? I think this is going to require a strong partnership between government agencies, between our affordable housing industry partners, and between the ISPs, right? Because the reality of it is, you know, as a government agency, we may set the policy, and in my opinion, it's a good policy, and we all agree, right? We need broadband, but, you know, our question is, now that we have the policy and the requirements in place, how do we implement it, and how do we get there to where, you know, our affordable housing projects have the appropriate system, you know, in place so that tenants are benefiting from broadband. And I think that's where experts like Steve and other providers and ISPs come into play. And I think it'd be great to have some kind of a platform where our affordable housing providers that don't have as much, you know, knowledge or experience with broadband, where they can go as a resource for, you know, making this decision on how do we go? Like I mentioned before, there's so many, even from our working group conversations and speaking with our development teams that had more experience, there were so many different options. And I could only imagine as a building owner, specifically for our smaller nonprofits and our MWBEs, I'm sure their heads would be spinning just like mine was in trying to understand, like, what approach do I go with in order to meet these HPD design guidelines and the new requirements.
I would add, go ahead, Steve.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say that, I mean, at the beginning of any of these conversations, when you start doing the ideation phase of any kind of rollout for broadband, you say, like, how much money is on the table and what's the timing? Because those two constraints are really a huge factor in what you deploy. And maybe you do phases and you deploy different technologies in those phases. So, I mean, that's what I say, like, I take into consideration and what's available in the area, as you said.
And I would dive a little deeper into both of those things. I think, the landscape, as I said, the ecosystem is complex. First, when you getting to the question of data availability, first is a question of what's the infrastructure availability that you have in your building and in your site. And that is both infrastructure to or around the site, whether that's access to fiber or that's fixed wireless coverage, as Steve was mentioning. But also, what is the infrastructure within your building? Do you know the wiring plant of your building and what it looks like? The second is, what's the provider landscape within there? So, and what are your agreements for the use of existing wiring within buildings with the provider landscape there? Who might be available to provide service to you and your tenants in there? Third is actually the tenant landscape and thinking about residents. Where are residents in approaching internet connectivity? Do they have the credit scores that would enable them to sign up for service from many service providers or not? What are the other digital literacy needs that they may have? And then the fourth category, I think, for building management is something that you're on top of, Steve, here of, what is your capacity as an institution, as an organization? What is the digital literacy of the building managers themselves to understand both the technical problems and the adaptive challenges of ensuring not only high quality access and affordable service, but also the adoption within it? So I think about those four categories of sort of understanding the infrastructure landscape, understanding the provider landscape, understanding the tenant landscape, and understanding your own organizational capacities. And I'm very hopeful that in the near future, there will be a fifth category there, which should make those four things easier. Of how can government help? What's the place in which the state or the city can intervene beyond design guidelines to help build organizational capacity among tenants, among building managers, among service providers to help thread the needle across those four pretty complex elements of the ecosystem?
I wouldn't disagree with that. There's points to that I don't disagree. There are some fine points that need to be sort of clarified, though. For a franchise like we have with Spectrum, we are required by our franchise to wire every building in our footprint. So we don't see these issues as an issue of infrastructure per se. We see it more as an issue of adoption. Access to buildings is a big problem for some of the ISPs. Sometimes an arrangement is made or some issue is had by one of the folks who own the building, and they only want one person in the building. So there's got to be a little bit more of what we talked about here, which is this public-private partnering and teamwork that we have to make certain that all customers have options that we discussed to have the type of internet service that they want to have. But there are issues sometimes in getting access into those buildings. And all it takes is for someone to say that they need that access. And we're required by our franchise to do so. And we are, in our minds, fully built out throughout the city of New York for every speed that you would want at a coax with coax that equals anything that we do with fiber. So there's things that we need to make sure that are clear as it relates to where the issues sometimes lie in being able to provide choices for customers in those buildings.
I actually hear a lot of that, Rodney, and appreciate it. And I do think that in many places, a provider that has great quality infrastructure to all the units is well positioned. I think one of the things that we've been thinking about recently is what's the longevity of the program? You know, this is a challenge that is an adaptive challenge, not just a technical challenge, I believe. It's something that we're trying to think through. What are the governance and management solutions now that will stand the test of time? Because while we're looking for, as you know, not just access now, because you are required to wire a unit, we're looking for affordability. And we know that there's the new legislation that's currently being contested in New York State. And then there's the adoption challenge, absolutely. I think the question that we've been thinking about is not just those, but is also, you know, what is the long-term future of the infrastructure in these buildings and to these buildings? And is coax sufficient for that? And if coax is not sufficient for that, well, you know, what are the incentives? What are the financial mechanisms that wind up enabling new wiring in these buildings or new wiring to these buildings? Because with the tenant base, we need to think about the finances of a private company like Spectrum being able to provide that level of incremental service in the wiring there. So I believe that while there are short-term challenges, there's going to be a medium or longer-term challenge in terms of the increased quality of the infrastructure in the units, to the units, and then of course the question of, you know, what is the organizational and governance apparatus that cuts across the ecosystem, and hopefully, I believe, empowers residents in it, and is not just a service provision to residents.
I agree with that, Danny. And just to add to the affordable part and the infrastructure, you know, infrastructure may not be a problem for certain locations. And I know most of our new construction buildings are wired by, you know, at least maybe 2 providers. But the wiring is there. And if the service can be provided but isn't affordable to the tenant, then what good is it, right? You have a bunch of wires that sit in somebody's closet, but they can't get internet service because not because of infrastructure reasons, but because of affordability reasons, right? That's like an additional couple of $100 for some people to just get broadband. And I think that's part of what we were trying to achieve with our new construction design guidelines, is to change the model and the approach so that broadband is provided at no cost to the tenant. And it does become like a utility where you have electricity and you have broadband. And it doesn't become a decision of, can I afford, you know, to pay for my internet, when there are a bunch of other insecurities that many of our tenants are already facing, right? With food insecurities, rent insecurities. Now, you know, to have to pay broadband, and the fact that everybody, especially now during the pandemic, has relied so heavily on internet, right? For working from home, remote learning, telehealth, all various reasons. Like, it would be difficult to have to make that choice of, do I have internet, or do I pay my rent, or do I buy food? Infrastructure, it may be there in many locations, although not all, but I think the equally important component of it is how do we make sure that it's affordable?
Yeah, we've tried to, and I appreciate that. And that's why we've made a real effort over this last year, particularly when the pandemic hit. You know, we already offer our Spectrum Internet Assist at a rate of about $14.99 per month for those who have free and reduced lunch or an SSI, you know, which would cover the majority of the public school students here in New York City that are in that need. We already offer that as a program. Obviously, the governor and the legislature just recently passed their legislation, and then you have the federal money that is available, which we are participating in, for the emergency broadband benefit, which is a discount of up to $50 per household that meet that eligibility requirement and assistance. And then, you know, we additionally have tried to work with the city over this last year, meeting with everyone in administration from the Department of Ed to, you know, all the other different sort of agencies about how we can create bulk purchase opportunities so that, maintaining that one account for either that developer or the landlord, or even in occasions where the city could participate with school districts, we could create very low cost, high speed opportunity for those residents that need it, and sort of, attack that issue of adoption that we feel is a major source of what's challenging with this digital divide.
Rodney, I think you bring up a great point that there are going to be an influx of federal funds through the emergency broadband benefit. However, many have pointed out that that's not a permanent fix. It is a stopgap. It's something that is going to exist and is going to be crucial for so many families right now in a time of need. But there's also a need for a longer term solution to ensure that broadband remains affordable even once subsidies go away. And of course, the governor has put forward this $15 affordability mandate. And there are a lot of potential strategies that I think organizations like the ones that we have represented in this panel today can take to ensure that affordability becomes something that is a long-term reality and not just a short-term subsidy. So I'd be curious to hear from the group, what are those longer-term solutions that we see to actually change the ecosystem in a way that isn't just a short-term subsidy?
So from the developer's perspective, I'm already designing new buildings with this in mind. So we're building out infrastructure for residents, but I've separated it out. So you have business service coming, dedicated residential service. In the future, if there's a subsidy or there's programming that allows that residential service to be supported or expanded, then it's already designed as such so that it's not mixed in with all of the other services that may come into the building. So in the future, depending on how we build out our facilities, legislation should be focusing on maybe providing that dedicated service for buildings so that we could do what Rodney said, which is bulk buy. So that if I have 10 buildings in an area, I say I want dedicated residential service, we go to Rodney, have that conversation, and as a developer, now we're serving 250 units as opposed to 250 units doing individual contracts.
I think that's a major one, and I do believe again that the state should use the American Rescue Plan fund as well as hopefully American Jobs Plan funding to wind up delivering new infrastructure and matching building managers to service providers, not only enabling a new high quality level of infrastructure in the buildings, but also and incorporating broadband into the rent expense, but also thinking about new opportunities for resident and long-term governance of that infrastructure. I actually want to note for a second, we received a question, I know, in the Q&A here about providers seeking exclusivity. And I think that's been a challenge in the broadband space for a long time. And one of the things that we like to think about is if you own the wiring, you can control your future, is a question. So I'm particularly wary of new infrastructure being provided in buildings that is proprietary infrastructure to a single provider with no rights for the developer or the management company to be able to kick that provider out and use that level of wiring in their buildings. So you could even think about it not dissimilar from affordable housing deals in which the state or the city provides subsidy for affordable housing for a term of affordable housing, at the end of which there needs to be a preservation deal done or to recapitalize the deal. So the question is, if you wind up having a new provider that comes in and the math requires exclusivity, which it very well may need to have exclusivity because the provider is providing a level of service that their return expectations are such that they need that level of exclusivity. Well, how do you ensure that that's something that works for 3 years or 5 years, maybe 7 years, but is not something that, 10, 15 years later, if that provider has now maybe even been bought by another provider, or winds up decreasing their level of service, that you wind up having some control over the longer term, the quality of service that your residents receive.
Yeah, I would agree. I agree with what everyone said. It's I think a really strong effort to partner together and work together. Everyone's at the table and supporting each other's needs. And we've also tried to figure out how to support those who are on the ground floor with these needs, right? And mentioned, how do we train folks? How do we build a knowledge base and understanding of technology once you receive it? We've talked about these steps, but it matters not if they get to all these steps, and the folks who are getting the information at the last part can't utilize it properly. We've spent about $4 million building about 40 technology labs across the city, to help social service organizations to provide computer hardware, software, free internet, free cable for community groups, churches, places like the Hudson Guild, places like National Action Network and Hudson Hispanic Federation, where the folks are going to go when they have these needs and where they need to learn how to sort of utilize technology in a way that expands their opportunity. So there's an investment there. There's an investment in the infrastructure, but there's also this investment in people so that they're empowered to be able to make smart choices about how to use their technology.
And I see that as an immediate need, seeing that we did launch our HPD design guidelines. So there's going to be a lot of members of our industry who are going to look for that guidance. So hopefully something can be set up soon where there is a centralized resource for our partners.
Rona, I want to give you an opportunity to answer a couple of the questions that came in through the Q&A about the city's expectation, whether internet plans for residents would be paid for by developers, and offer a little bit more color on some of your hopes and aspirations for what these design guidelines will ultimately lead to, and how the housing developer community can best play a role in implementing and shaping the future of them.
Okay, so the first question was on the cost and whether or not developers would bear the cost. I am actually not the person with expertise on cost, but my colleagues are at HPD are working to figure out how to deal with the cost component of broadband. We are in the process of just gathering data and talking to our housing partners to see, especially those that have more expertise, to see what kind of a policy we can roll out on the underwriting end. So there's definitely more to come out on that. And I'll use Steve's analogy during one of our earlier calls. It's almost like we are flying the plane as we're building it. We rolled out this requirement because we knew that it was timely and we needed to do so. So we capitalized on that, but we don't have all the pieces figured out yet. But we do know that we're heading in the right direction. So definitely more to come on the cost piece. And then the other question was, can you repeat the other one?
Generally, we've spoken a lot about the role that state and city governments can play in ensuring affordable access for housing. And what are your hopes for the future of these guidelines and what they may turn into, not only in the immediate term, but over the next few years?
So I'm hoping the guidelines were launched in March, right? And we're approaching it as like broadband where feasible, right? So it's got to work within your term sheets. But my hope is that developers really take the extra step to figure out how to make it work within their term sheets, and to work with us to come up with a plan that is affordable and a plan where it actually works. My hope is also to extend, I know we've been talking a lot about new construction, but my hope is to extend this to our existing housing stock. right? Danny mentioned that there is a large existing housing stock there that also has broadband needs. And so internally, we're actually starting conversations now on how we can replicate our requirements for new construction for our preservation projects. So hopefully that's something that we can roll out soon. That's definitely our next project. So look out for that. But I think too, just generally, there is a lot of focus on broadband, and I think it'd be great to see funding resources so that we can address the cost issue. So if there's a way to work on that, both, on the state, federal, and city level.
Absolutely. We all know that there are potentially billions of dollars on the table, at least from the federal side, not only for affordable housing, but also for broadband. So it seems like there's a particular intersection here where you can leverage multiple sources of funding, at least from the federal side. And I pose this question to the entire group, given that incoming flood of funding, what do we think is the most appropriate way for those who are going to be on the receiving end to route those funds in a way that is additive and in a way that is effective in achieving this goal of universal access and adoption? I know the federal panel is happening at the same time as ours, so they're discussing some of this, but what are our thoughts?
Well, I'm going to jump in here because I just want to mention, and thanks to all of you panelists, but I just want to say that NYSAFAH has been anticipating this and in working collaboratively and trying to bring the industry perspective to all the conversations the city's been having. We've also tried to organize ourselves in a way that we can be constructive in accessing a lot of those federal resources when they come to New York State. So I think everyone on the panel knows, and I think it's time to let the audience know that NYSAFAH is going to be working collaboratively with the city and state agencies to try and develop this retrofit roadmap. So, if anybody wants to be more involved and is part of the affordable housing industry, join with NYSAFAH in providing the roadmap, hopefully, for how to deploy efficiently and effectively to as many residents as possible the federal funds around broadband. I think everybody understands how important affordable housing is in delivering these resources. And so we hope to be part of the conversation in the months and years to come.
I would only add there, Jolie, and we're thrilled to be working with you on that work and designing something for New York State with the generous support of Schmidt Futures and the Ford Foundation here. But I also want to note that while that program needs to be designed for a retrofit roadmap across the state, it needs to be done in short order to ensure that the funds are administered not just quickly, but also equitably. I think anybody who's joining here should not only, I think, get in touch, but also starts to understand the landscape around your portfolio. What is infrastructure access in each of your buildings? Where are your tenants in terms of adoption? What is the wiring within your building? Is there additional capacity within your ducts to lay new wire, to install new wires if need be? Start to do that data collection actually about your portfolio, because that's going to be important to design the program. And I'll say, last thing to answer your question as well, Anjali, is I think that it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. It's going to need, the state is a big, diverse place. The affordable housing portfolio is large and diverse with many different building typologies and so on. And so, finding the right typologies within the portfolio across the state and matching those building typologies and resident profiles to the right level of government assistance in terms of capital as well as services is a major challenge, and something that we're really excited to be diving into with NYSAFAH over the next few months to wind up trying to design a program that we can recommend to HCR and HPD for rollout across the state.
Thanks, Danny. And what is the best way for people who are listening in to get in touch? How do people engage with this work? We have one housing developer on the call right now, Steve, but there are many more who are listening in. So what is the best way to continue this conversation, given that we have 1 minute on the clock now?
Jolie, you may be on mute.
I think Jolie's on mute.
Jolie,
we can't hear you.
Come NYSAFAH.org. Sorry. NYSAFAH.org has all my contact information. If you're already a NYSAFAH member, you know how to find me. And if you're not, please join and we'll get you involved.
well, with that, I think we are at time. I will once again thank Jolie and the NYSAFAH team for putting today together and giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. Thank you again to Congressman Bowman for kicking us off at the beginning, and a big virtual round of applause to all of our panelists for engaging in such a thoughtful, wonderful discussion today. Really appreciate your time, and to everyone in the audience, we hope we can continue this conversation, which is not only of local and state, but also of national importance. So thank you all for your time.